Denister says, "Hello, I've been thinking about my body weight recently. I'm about 63 centimeters and I'm 63 kilos now. Oh yes,
Jennifer,
oh yes, a parkour athlete, and I do feel like I'm not jumping just as explosively, so I'd be stronger. Is a 2 kg gain too much? What should you get more optimal weight lift to ratio? Um,
this is an interesting one because 5'3" at 63 kilos, you're probably not you're probably not too far off being optimal. Like certainly wouldn't want to be over 80 kilos. I'd say at 5'3".
yeah,
This is something where a certain amount of playing around with it, a small bit of auditing yourself, a small bit of like test retest,
test.
is the best thing to do. So you've gone through, like, you obviously haven't changed in height. You've gone from 61 to 63, and you don't feel as good. What I would do is like spend a bit of time here. If I was to just strap a 2 kilo weight onto one and ask him to jump continuously or whatever, or do a max vert jump, he's obviously not going to have the same outcomes immediately. You've built a small bit of strength, but the strength outcomes do take a bit of time to convert over to power output. Like power and speed, and particularly in like the jumping and rebounding, it takes a bit longer for that kind of 5 kilo PB to convert over. You'll need a bit of skills practice. So do take a bit of time. Like, don't immediately cut down. With 2 kilos is very little. Obviously 2 kilos at 63 is a lot more significant than 2 kilos at 100 kilos. But I would say spend a bit of time there, maintain your strength, see how your strength is going. And then it's very, very rare that an extra bit of muscle is bad, even in parkour. Being a small bit stronger, being a small bit more resistant to injury is very beneficial.
More what I was talking about is there is something in sports where there's a lot of endurance, for example, or any kind of sport really, is the power to weight ratio. So this is something typically you'd see is that power P divided by 2/3 of the lifter's mass, or in a more appropriate scenario, it would be the lifter's lean body mass. And there's a variety of different coefficients then that you could add to this depending on the sport. But typically what you'd see is, for example, you get the lifter's power from a ergometer from a rower, for example, or a bike, and you get this power value. You divide it then by the lifter's lean body mass. Sometimes it's 2/3 of the lifter's mass, and you get a ratio of something. Let's say you get zero point 0.8 divided by 50 kilos of lean mass, and we'll get a certain number, and that's that lifter's power to weight ratio. But let's say then this lifter takes a shitload of drugs and gains a load of lean body mass, but for some reason when he takes the drugs, he doesn't gain a load of power. So his power coefficient stays at 0.8, but his lean body mass goes to 60 kilograms. And his power to weight ratio, that number will drop. So it might be zero point 0.8 divided by like 50 would be something like 0.0016. But if we went to like 60 kilograms, we'd end up with like 0.0013. So our number is going down. This value is decreasing. And so this is an important value to take into account when we're looking at athletes. If you have a lot of professional athletes, if you have people like Tyson, Fury, and Wilder, who are multi-million-dollar athletes, you best believe you should probably be looking at this. Most athletes, you don't need to worry about this. You can kind of just look at an athlete's body fat percentage and see how their training is going. As their coach, you'll say, look, they're very fit and they're very strong. Their endurance is good. We're hitting all our markers. We don't need to test this. The problem then with this, though, is while you need to be able to produce a certain amount of power in boxing, you don't need a huge excess of power, because obviously power comes at a cost. For example, the power weightlifters can produce is very limited, and it's over 6 lifts, whereas boxers might need to do this for 12 rounds for a variety of different repetitions. So really what we want is a certain power to weight ratio, a certain coefficient, but then we also need adequate stores of fat tissue for things like lipolysis, for aerobic, cardiovascular, different things. There's a certain level of stuff you need to be taking into account with these athletes. So I suppose looking at an athlete isn't the fairest way of doing it. In Fury's case, for example, he's kind of messy, even for a professional athlete, it'd be fair to say. But when you sort of look at Wilder, there's no real way of telling, for example, what someone's body fat composition or something like that is. But ideally, your S&C coach should be looking at his force production, look at his muscle mass, but then also looking at how his aerobic training is going and making good decisions based off of that.
Yeah, there's probably two other things that would add into this. The first thing is, like, when you talk directly about conditioning and someone's ability to last, so like if you take conditioning to be how well someone can last the entire length of their sport, the entire duration of their sport. If you take like one of the most classic cases of aerobic conditioning or aerobic conditioning tests would be a beep test. If you put 5 kilos on, or if you put around 5% of someone's body mass on in a beep test, you can reduce their effectiveness by 1 standard deviation. So you can really, really affect somebody's ability to partake in a beep test or get a good value in a beep test by adding a very small amount of body weight, right? In anyone's case, adding 5% of body weight as a muscle tissue, fat tissue, the calluses that builds up around your brain tissue, right? It doesn't matter where you add the mass. It doesn't matter if it's fat mass, lean tissue mass, bone mass. Anywhere you add mass onto a human frame, they become less efficient at moving themselves around. In the case of this fight in particular, I think Wilder was around 10 kilos heavier than he was from it the first time he fought Fury. And that's where people are talking about, yeah, so he's yacked, right? It doesn't matter if that yackedness is 10 kilos of whatever, right? If he's wearing flip-flops and they're 10 kilos heavier, they'll still affect your ability, because it's the same cardiovascular system. His blood values probably aren't that much different, even though he's so jacked, his blood values are probably very different. But that's the important thing here, right? The actual mass you have to move around really, really taxes your cardiovascular system. To go on from there, when people talk about, oh, he's too jacked, Tyson Fury wasn't as bad because he was just kind of flat and bit fat, like, but he wasn't too jacked, he wasn't carrying too much muscle. That is absolute bollocks. So what you're looking at there is people think they have this equation in their head of muscle tissue is very, very expensive to hold on to, right? Muscle tissue is very expensive to hold on to. Metabolism of muscle tissue, it costs a lot of calories, it costs a lot of energy. But when you look at the specific use case of in a boxing match, it doesn't matter if he's very yacked or if he's very fat. It's very advantageous if it's more muscle tissue, because what muscle tissue will allow us to do during a fight is it will allow us to produce more force. It will allow us to store more glycogen, so we'll actually have better ability to last for a longer time. Fat tissue will do almost nothing. One thing fat tissue might have as an advantage is it might have slightly less nerve cells, so it might take up less pain tolerance when you get hit in there, but I don't think these guys really care about that. So it's a small bit of a nuanced argument. We're probably going to do an argument on this specifically, because we were just emailing with a boxer today who was talking about that fight and the differences in body weight. But it's an interesting little one. I'd be very, very hazy though about someone saying, oh, he's too jacked, he's going to be so slow. Like, any difference in body weight will affect your conditioning.
But that is a common thing we do here, and we really hear it out of boxers as well. You don't see it as much in mixed martial arts, but I suppose boxing as